Michelle Harrison hadn't set foot in Iowa in over 20 years. It wasn't out of disdain or forgetfulness. Life had simply moved in another direction. Her job in Chicago, her modest but well-structured apartment, her quiet daily routines as a logistics coordinator at a global freight company, all of it existed hundreds of miles away from the flat, wind-brushed fields of the Midwest. That entire part of her life had been relegated to the mental filing cabinet labeled extended family, the kind of branch you nod to during holidays but rarely revisit. So when the letter arrived from a small legal office in the town of Coleridge, bearing news that she had inherited land from her late uncle, she almost tossed it aside, assuming it was some clerical error. Her Uncle Victor had been reclusive, a man of few words and fewer connections, living on the outskirts of nowhere, occupying land nobody really cared about at least. That's how her father had always described him. The letter didn't contain any dramatic language. It was, in fact, stunningly dry. Just a paragraph explaining that Victor Harrison had passed away intestate, and as the next of kin, but Michelle was now the legal successor to the property he had held in eastern Iowa. There were no photos, no emotional gestures, just coordinates, parcel information, and a suggestion that she reach out if she wished to formalize or refuse the transfer. She left the envelope on the table for a week before revisiting it. Something about the simplicity of it, the way it wasn't asking her for anything, not even acknowledgement, gnawed at her. When she looked up the property number online and saw an old satellite image of a narrow, rectangular stretch of land with a faint gravel road cutting through it, her curiosity finally overtook her indifference. The drive was longer than she remembered. The farther she got from the highway, the more the world seemed to flatten out into miles of golden soybeans and cornfields, occasionally interrupted by silos or weather-beaten farmhouses that seemed to lean into the wind. She wasn't sentimental by nature, and nostalgia wasn't something she indulged in, but the smell of the air out there was like something clean had punched through the usual static of her thoughts. There was a distinct smell of soil, dry grass, and machinery familiar yet distant. When she finally arrived in Coleridge, the town didn't welcome her so much as it tolerated her presence. A small diner, one gas station, a hardware store that doubled as the post office and bait shop. She asked the cashier for directions to the parcel of land, and the woman behind the counter gave her a look that lingered just long enough to be noticeable before pointing at a faded county map mounted on the wall. That one out by Mill Creek. You'll see the split in the fence line. Ain't nobody been out there in years. Michelle didn't expect much when she turned off the main road and followed the gravel path toward the plot. She'd seen the image online, overgrown, plain, nothing remarkable. But even that didn't prepare her for the sight that greeted her as she pulled up alongside what was supposed to be her property. There was a new gate, heavy-duty, black powder-coated metal welded to thick steel posts set deep into the earth. On either side of the gate stretched a clean-cut fence line that ran far past what should have been the property boundary. Attached to the gate was a professionally printed sign that read "Private Property, No Trespassing, W. Rex." That name meant nothing to her at the time. Michelle stepped out of her car and approached the gate, scanning the area beyond it. The grass was shorter than it should have been. A small tractor sat off in the distance, and tire marks in the dirt suggested regular use. She looked around for any sign of a residence or trailer. Nothing, just cultivated emptiness. Before she had time to consider her next move, a pickup truck rolled up from the opposite side, crunching gravel beneath thick, all-terrain tires. The man behind the wheel looked to be in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and sharp, observant eyes. He killed the engine but didn't get out of the truck. Instead, he leaned his arm on the door and regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and polite dismissal. "You lost?" he asked, voice low, neutral. Michelle straightened her back slightly, keeping her tone calm. "I don't think so. This parcel Victor Harrison's land, I inherited it." The man raised his eyebrows slightly, not in surprise, but in a kind of practiced patience. "That land's been dormant for over a decade." No one's been on it. It was just sitting here, so I've been taking care of it. Mowing it, clearing out brush, keeping it clean. That's not what the records say, Michelle replied evenly. It still belongs to Victor Harrison. Now it's mine. A pause. He looked past her, toward her car, then back at her, and finally stepped out of the truck. He didn't look aggressive, but there was a stillness to him that made her keep her guard up. He walked toward the gate and tapped the sign with 2 fingers. "I'm Willard Rex," he said. "Been using this land for grazing a few years now. Not trying to make trouble. But if something's left untouched for long enough, folks start to assume it's abandoned. Especially out here." Michelle kept her face unreadable, her instincts sharpening. "It wasn't abandoned. It just wasn't visited. There's a difference." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that says he hears you but doesn't agree. "Well, guess we'll be figuring that out soon enough." They didn't exchange goodbyes. She got back into her car, pulled a wide U-turn, and drove away. Her hands were tight on the wheel. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was alert, now focused. Something about the quiet authority in his tone, the way he had claimed stewardship over something that wasn't his, felt rehearsed. Not opportunistic, strategic. Back in her motel room, she flipped through the contents of the folder the law office had sent. Deed information, coordinates, tax statements, everything was in order. But what gnawed at her wasn't just the nerve of this man. It was the efficiency of the fence, the sharpness of the signage, and the way he spoke like he'd done this before. Like it wasn't new. Like it worked. She went to the county records office the next morning to verify everything, only to be met with another wrinkle. Willard Rex had indeed submitted a request for adverse possession last year, citing continuous use, land improvement, and abandonment. The claim was still under administrative review. Michelle's name had not been listed in the challenge because, until 2 weeks ago, no one had legally inherited the land. She was told, with some sympathy, that while she was now the legal owner, the previous lack of clear title activity, it could be used against her in a civil dispute unless she moved quickly. That word quickly stuck with her all the way back to her car. She wasn't from this world. She didn't speak the language of landlines and fences, of local grudges and property surveys. But she understood systems. She understood how procedures worked. If this man thought he could take something from her because she was late to the game, he didn't know what kind of opponent he'd just created. Michelle wasn't interested in drama. She didn't need a feud. But she had inherited something now, land, yes, but also the quiet weight of someone's legacy. And she would not let it be erased just because someone else thought it looked forgotten. Not yet, not ever. Michelle didn't wait long to act. The moment she returned to Chicago, she used her company's legal benefits program to secure a consultation with a property attorney named Angela Forrester, seasoned, concise, calm, and distinctly unimpressed by theatrics. Michelle appreciated that. She wasn't looking for someone who would express outrage on her behalf. She needed someone who understood the law and how to make it work, quickly and effectively. Angela reviewed the inheritance documents and county filings, browsed through the adverse possession submission from Willard Rex, and sat back in her chair with a flat expression that Michelle couldn't read right away. "He knows exactly what he's doing," Angela said after a moment. "He's not just playing cowboy, he's been maneuvering this. Everything he submitted is phrased to check boxes, continuous use, land improvement, lack of dispute. But we have a window." "Barely." Michelle leaned in slightly. "What's the risk?" "If we don't contest this within 30 days, the county may allow his claim to proceed to court. And if he proves even partial uninterrupted use, a judge might award him at least a portion of the land, especially in rural cases, where visual signs of abandonment hold a lot of weight with juries. But he's made a mistake." Michelle raised an eyebrow, waiting. Angela tapped one of the scanned documents with a neatly manicured fingernail. "He filed that before your name was officially on record as owner. Technically, that gives us an angle. You're now the active title holder. That means we can legally contest it under continuity of ownership through succession, assuming we move fast. Michelle felt the logic click into place like gears in a machine. She had no legal background, but systems made sense to her. Timelines, dependencies, filing protocols. She lived by them in her professional life and saw no reason why this should be different. Angela gave her a short list of immediate actions: file notice of ownership with the county clerk, submit a formal objection to the adverse possession claim, request a temporary hold on any proceedings related to the property, and crucially physically demonstrate active ownership. Not symbolic, not theoretical, tangible. Within 48 hours, Michelle was back in Iowa with an official notarized packet in her glove compartment, a new deed with her name freshly entered into public record. It's and a signed letter from Angela submitted to the administrative judge handling Rex's claim. But that wasn't enough. According to Angela, the courts would weigh actual use more heavily than paper trails. If Willard Rex could show evidence that he'd improved or maintained the land even without ownership, then Michelle had to provide proof of her own activity, and not just through words or filings. She didn't rent construction crews or security teams. That wasn't her style. But she did visit a nearby general contracting business run by a local man named Grant Rowley, who agreed to help her clear the parcel, remove encroaching brush lines, and place visible property markers. She paid him up front for a week's worth of labor and insisted that everything be recorded with date, stamped photo logs. Grant didn't ask too many questions, but his silence came with perceptive eyes. It didn't take long for word to spread. By the next morning, Michelle noticed how people at the diner paused longer than usual when she walked in. A pair of men at the corner table lowered their voices when she passed. No one said anything directly, but the message was clear. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was stepping into something. 2 days later, when she arrived at the parcel with coffee for Grant's crew, she noticed something immediately off. The wooden stakes that had been hammered in along the northern fence line were gone, ripped out clean, not broken or weathered. The boundary flags were missing, and several tire tracks now crossed deep into her section of the field, tearing up the soil near the drainage ditch. Grant stood near the site with arms crossed, his jaw tight. "We didn't do that," he said before she could speak. "We wrapped last night just before dark." Everything was still up. Someone came through late. Michelle didn't panic, but the knot in her stomach twisted a little tighter. She walked the property line slowly, documenting the damage with her phone. Not because she expected the sheriff's office to send out detectives, but because Angela had told her clearly document everything. Even if it amounted to nothing in the eyes of the law, consistent patterns built narrative, and narrative mattered in front of a judge. That afternoon, she drove straight to the county sheriff's substation, filed a report of property interference, and handed over a USB stick with photos. The officer behind the desk didn't look enthusiastic, but he took the report without sarcasm or delay. That alone was a small win. She didn't hear from Willard directly until the following Sunday. He pulled up as she was standing near the old shed foundation, nothing more than a few concrete slabs half swallowed by the earth, and stepped out of his truck in clean jeans and a faded green flannel. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. That would have made things simpler. Instead, he walked up slowly, hands at his sides, and stopped just outside her reach. "I heard you made a claim," he said. Michelle didn't answer. He looked around, scanning the work that had been done: the cleared brush, the new gravel at the entrance, the visible line where Grant's crew had started regrading the slope. Then he met her eyes again. "You're really going to come all the way back, just to fight over something nobody wanted?" "It's not about wanting," Michelle said, keeping her tone even. "It's about what's mine." Willard exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound of disbelief or annoyance. "You're not from here," he said, as if that somehow explained everything. "You don't understand how things work out here." Michelle turned slightly, picking up a clipboard with the permit tags Grant had posted the day before. She didn't raise her voice. "You know what I understand, Mr. Rex?" that you put a sign with your name on land you don't own, that you filed a claim when no one could challenge you, and that now someone is. He studied her, face unreadable, then nodded once. Guess we'll let the court sort it, then. She didn't reply. He left without further comment. The next day, Grant called to tell her that someone had let air out of all 4 of his work trailer's tires. Not slashed, not destroyed, just enough to delay the crew for hours. Michelle offered to pay the difference in labor, but Grant waved her off. Not the first time we've dealt with this kind of thing. We'll keep going. That night, back at the motel, Michelle sat on the edge of the bed, holding the old photo of her Uncle Victor that one of the county clerks had dug out of their archives. It was grainy, black and white, probably from the 70s. He stood beside a truck, holding a steel post driver with a stubborn, determined look on his face. It was the only expression she remembered her father ever describing when they talked about Victor, the man who never let anything go. The man who said nothing but meant everything. She placed the photo on the nightstand, took out her laptop, and began drafting a full statement of ownership and activity for Angela to submit in tandem with the objection. Whatever was coming next would be ugly. It would be slow, bureaucratic, and expensive. But Michelle had made her choice. She wasn't just going to show up. She was going to hold the line. And this time, no one was taking it from her. The first time Michelle saw the fence extension, she didn't react outwardly. It was the kind of moment where you recognize something is wrong the same way you notice a bitter aftertaste. The effect is slow, but irreversible. The crew had been working through the southern section of the property that morning, flattening the overgrowth near the tree line where the lot tapered off toward a neighboring field. Michelle was walking the perimeter alone, clipboard in hand, cross-checking the layout with the county's GIS map, when she noticed it. A section of the fence that hadn't been there before, about 20 feet long, connected seamlessly to the existing line but now extending at an angle that crept inward by several meters, stealing a clean bite out of the southern border. The stakes were new. The chain link mesh was taut and spotless. Someone had installed it in the last 24 hours. She didn't say anything right away. She finished the walkthrough, signed off on the day's work, and drove straight to the surveyor's office. The man who greeted her, Ben Morton, was a county licensed specialist who had worked in the region for over 3 decades. He was practical, slightly aloof, and obsessed with topography in the way only people deeply comfortable in their discipline can be. When she showed him the latest photos, he nodded slowly, pulled up his own archive, and began dragging map layers on his screen. "That's not just off," he said, voice dry but firm. "That's a deliberate reconfiguration. They didn't just adjust the angle, they set new corner stakes entirely. Whoever did that was trying to reshape the plot." Michelle didn't flinch. "Can you document it?" He gave her a look, as if insulted by the question. "Yeah, of course. But if someone's trying to establish precedent, they're not doing it casually. It's coordinated." Coordinated. That word had begun to nest in her mind, growing roots. This wasn't spontaneous aggression. It was incremental, controlled, something done by someone who understood that theft wasn't always a matter of sudden force. Sometimes it was a matter of being just early enough, just subtle enough, and just tolerated enough to slide under the threshold of dispute. Michelle signed the work order, scheduled a formal resurvey for the entire plot, and filed another interference report with the sheriff's office that same afternoon. She attached the new map overlays and GPS data, flagged it with photos, and dropped off a hard copy at Angela's office on her way out of town. The following week passed with a strange rhythm. On the surface, everything appeared to move forward. The crew finished clearing the main field, new perimeter signs were posted, and the erosion-prone areas were reinforced with gravel. But Michelle noticed the tension tightening, like a taut wire you didn't realize had been pulling until it finally snapped. First, it was the delivery truck that didn't show. Grant had ordered concrete footing materials for the Western Gate support, but the supplier claimed no one was at the site to receive it, despite Michelle herself having been there all day. Then, on Thursday, an envelope appeared on the windshield of her rental car, no postage, no name, just a single sheet of paper, with a line written in uneven block letters. No one wants this to get messy. You're not from here. She didn't show it to anyone. It wasn't that she was frightened, she wasn't. But fear and fatigue weren't the same. And what she felt wasn't dread, it was exhaustion of a particular kind. The kind that creeps in when you realize every move forward requires a defense. Every act of ownership is treated like a challenge. She had been methodical, respectful, and legally grounded. And yet someone was deliberately testing her, probing to see where she would retreat, where she would bend. She didn't bend. Instead, she hired a second crew to install a visible boundary line, surveyor's tape, solar-powered lights, and temporary posts to be replaced later by permanent markers. She made sure the receipts included timestamps and GPS coordinates. Angela's paralegal compiled the photos and records into a presentation folder titled Assertive Possession Timeline, and the name made Michelle's lip curl with a brief, dry smile. It was war and paperwork. But even then, she sensed it was building towards something more physical. That shift came the following Tuesday. She had just arrived at the site shortly before 9 a.m., coffee in hand, walking up toward the shed where Grant was loading gear. A sharp sound cracked across the field, a sudden metallic thunk followed by shouts. Michelle dropped the coffee instinctively and moved toward the noise. By the time she reached the clearing near the eastern end of the property, she saw what had happened. One of Grant's work trucks had its rear windshield shattered. A rock, still warm to the touch, lay on the flatbed. There were no witnesses. No cameras caught the angle. And the road nearby, unpaved and public, offered no clues. But the message was unmistakable. Someone had crossed from quiet intimidation to direct sabotage. Grant looked at her with a mixture of apology and restrained anger. "This ain't a coincidence," he muttered. "They're hoping we'll quit. Hoping you'll fold." Michelle knelt beside the broken glass, ran her fingers lightly across the debris, and stood up without a word. She didn't need to say anything. She called Angela that evening and authorized the next stage, a temporary injunction motion to freeze any construction, interference, or use of the land by third parties, citing escalating harassment and physical disruption. It wouldn't stop everything, but it would make the legal consequences heavier. Angela warned her that the process wouldn't be fast. "Courts don't like land disputes," she said, "especially ones without blood or a bulldozer. But you've got a pattern now. That's leverage." The next morning, Michelle drove to the county archive again. She had to question something she hadn't thought to check until now. If Willard had done this before. Not just claimed use of land, but followed this pattern: temporary use, gradual encroachment, legal submission. The clerk was cooperative, if a little tired. "We don't keep track of that unless it's court-ordered," she said. But you could pull property disputes filed in the last 10 years by surname. It took Michelle 2 hours to find what she needed. A dispute filed 6 years ago. A woman named Carla Denton had contested a small pasture boundary against a party named Willard Rex. Same claim language, same use of land care. Case dismissed when she failed to show for the second hearing. Michelle stared at the page, jaw tight. She had seen enough. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a method. That evening she walked the full edge of her land as the sun dipped low behind the horizon, painting the dry sky with streaks of rust and orange. The light shifted against the freshly installed boundary stakes, casting long shadows across the soil. For a moment she stood still, letting the silence press against her. No engine sounds, no voices, just the sound of cicadas rising in waves. She wasn't angry. She was ready. Let him try again. She'd meet him there. By the second week of September, Michelle had begun to move differently, not in fear, but in precision. Every arrival on site was logged. Every interaction, however minor, was annotated and archived. The tone of the conflict had shifted from territorial jostling to something colder, slower, and more procedural, which in many ways was more dangerous. The physical acts of sabotage had lessened, but the sense of being observed hadn't. She could feel it when she walked the perimeter, especially near the eastern side, where the field dipped into a shallow slope. There was no direct line of sight, no camera footage, nothing overt, but the unease persisted like a distant hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. Willard hadn't returned in person, not since the windshield incident, but his presence lingered in the changed angles of fences, in the extra care the work crew took when parking equipment, and in the tone Grant used when talking about locals asking questions. Angela had filed the temporary injunction, and the judge had issued a preliminary hold-in order prohibiting any physical alterations to the contested boundaries by either party until the next review hearing. On paper, it was a neutral measure. In practice, it worked in Michelle's favor. She wasn't the one who had been altering fence lines. She wasn't the one who needed momentum to shift property lines in silence. Still, she knew this wouldn't stop him. It would only make him recalibrate. It was during this legal lull that she decided to find out what exactly Willard had been protecting, because as the situation dragged on, it became increasingly clear to her that the land wasn't the point. It was a tool, or a wall, or a barrier, but not the goal itself. She suspected it had something to do with the southwestern edge of her parcel, where the terrain abruptly changed, where a dry creek cut through the base of a bluff and disappeared into a copse of trees that didn't show up clearly on satellite maps. No one had worked that edge yet. Grant's crew had been focused on more accessible sections, and Michelle had marked the area for erosion control work later in the fall. But something about it pulled at her. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. The kind that told her when someone was masking one purpose with another. She drove out alone late that Friday, arriving just before dusk, when the air was sharp and still. The sun was low enough that the trees cast long shadows over the brush, making the edge of the lot feel deeper, older. She parked at the west side, walked the last 100 yards on foot, careful not to disturb the gravel line that marked the surveyed boundary. The grass was overgrown, knee-deep in some places, and dry enough to crackle beneath each step. No tire marks, no footprints, but as she approached the grove, she saw what she hadn't seen before, a cut path. It wasn't recent. The brush had grown back in some places. But the line was too straight, too consistent to be natural. Someone had used it regularly months ago, maybe last season. It curved around the bluff, tucked beneath a deadfall of low-hanging branches, and ended near a shallow pit lined with black plastic. At first, Michelle didn't understand what she was looking at. Then she noticed the green plastic barrels stacked behind the tree line, half covered by a rotting tarp. 4 of them. Industrial grade. She stepped closer, carefully peeled back the tarp, and saw the markings: no brand, no shipping code, just faint stencils of numbers and letters she couldn't place. She didn't touch anything else. She didn't take photos. She backed out slowly, walked the same route in reverse, and didn't run. She drove straight back into town, parked in front of Angela's office even though it was closed, and texted her to call immediately. Then she sat in the car with the engine off and hands clenched around the steering wheel, heart beating with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who had just crossed a threshold. Angela called back 10 minutes later. Michelle explained what she saw, every detail, omitting nothing. Angela was silent for a long time, then said, "You didn't open the barrels, did you?" "No." "Good. Don't go back. Not alone." Michelle stared at the darkened sidewalk outside the law office and said, "You think it's waste?" "I think someone used that section of land for something they didn't want on their own property," Angela replied. "And if you have a record of trying to report it, it's not your liability. I'll talk to someone I know at the environmental office." Quietly. Michelle didn't sleep that night. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the awareness that the conflict had evolved. It was no longer just about legal boundaries. The land wasn't just being claimed. It had been used covertly, deliberately, and if someone went to those lengths to hide it, then Michelle's reappearance wasn't just inconvenient. It was destabilizing. She had unknowingly become the flaw in a much longer pattern, the break in a rhythm that someone like Willard couldn't afford. 2 days later, a man came to the motel asking for her by name. He said he was from the county environmental agency, showed her his credentials, and asked if he could speak privately. They met in the small courtyard behind the building, near the vending machines. He didn't press her. He asked precise questions. Did she know what was in the barrels? Did she recognize the numbering format? Had she seen any signs of leakage? She answered truthfully, "No, no, no." When she asked him what it might mean, he hesitated, then said, "Sometimes old farms take shortcuts. Illegal dumping, expired chemicals, pesticide runoff if it was abandoned. People assume no one will check." "But it wasn't abandoned," Michelle said flatly. "I know," he replied. "That's why you're here. And that's why someone else probably didn't want you to be." The report was filed quietly. Nothing public. No police. Not yet. The official review would take weeks, maybe longer. But Michelle understood that from now on, this wasn't just her fight. And that meant she couldn't afford to treat it like a personal dispute anymore. She updated Angela. She kept working with Grant. But her approach changed. She no longer walked the property alone. She avoided the bluff. She maintained distance and clarity, ensuring every step she took was measured and recorded. She wasn't retreating, but she wasn't charging ahead either. She was anchoring herself. Legally, physically, strategically. Because she knew now that the man who tried to take her land hadn't expected her to stay. And more than that, he hadn't planned for someone who would force the truth into the open. Michelle didn't expect retaliation to come through official channels. She had braced herself for more late-night trespassing, another slashed tire, a thrown rock maybe, but not a letter from the Coleridge building and land use committee stamped with a red notice of compliance review. The envelope was thin, neatly folded, and unsigned. The letter inside stated, in passive bureaucratic language, that her parcel had been flagged for multiple potential infractions, unpermitted land alterations, and unauthorized use of heavy equipment on a historically zoned lot, and possible disruption of designated agricultural buffer zones. It was the kind of letter that didn't accuse but implied, one that didn't order her to stop working, but warned her that continued action could complicate her legal standing until clarification was complete. She read it 3 times. It didn't name a complainant. It didn't refer to a specific date, but she knew exactly where it had come from. Angela wasn't surprised. "This is what happens when the other side stops throwing rocks and starts playing chess," she said during their call later that afternoon. "They can't win through possession, so they're escalating through regulation. This isn't just pushback, it's calculated pressure." Michelle didn't ask how Willard Rex had managed to trigger a zoning review. She already understood the answer. Influence didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be visible. It just needed to be embedded in the right office at the right time with a quiet word and a convenient memory of a campaign donation from 5 years ago. Angela advised her to hold off on further grading work until they could schedule an independent compliance assessor to walk the site and sign off on everything. "I don't trust their paperwork," Angela said. "We'll bring in our own." The delay cost her almost 2 weeks. The crew was put on standby. The soil erosion mitigation had to pause. Michelle used the time to double-check every permit, every invoice, every time-stamped photograph. She built a folder the size of a small phone book, labeled each tab by category, and sent a complete copy to Angela's office for redundancy. Meanwhile, Willard remained absent from the land but present in effect. One afternoon, Michelle saw a new camera mounted just outside the neighboring property line, aimed squarely at her entrance gate. It wasn't concealed. That wasn't the point. It was a reminder. A passive statement, "We see you." She began to sense a shift in how people in town responded to her. The grocery store clerk no longer made small talk. A waitress at the diner forgot her order twice and avoided eye contact. Grant's crew still showed up, but 2 workers rotated out that week with little notice, claiming personal obligations before disappearing entirely. Grant said nothing, but Michelle didn't need him to. Tension doesn't need explanation when it soaks into everything around you. The environmental agency still hadn't returned with full test results from the creek bed and barrels. Angela had cautioned her not to push them. They're slow by design, she had explained. If there's something illegal there, you'll know soon enough. But until they file, it's not leverage. It's just suspicion. Still, Michelle felt that everything was stalling at once. Every move she made required 10 layers of documentation. Every step forward felt like walking through tar. And all the while, the land waited flat, silent and contested. It was during this pause that she received the invitation. A folded note, slid under her motel door at some point between dusk and nightfall, sealed with a red paperclip. Inside, in slanted handwriting, "Come talk. 9 p.m. No games. By the hay shed behind the Willard property. Just you." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. She stared at it for several minutes, heart silent, eyes calculating. It could be a trap. A provocation. An attempt to bait her into trespassing, give Willard grounds to file a complaint. Or it could be the first crack in the wall, a gesture from someone close to him, someone who had seen too much and needed to say something. She weighed every possibility, then texted Angela, left a voicemail for Grant, and drove out at 8:45. The Willard property sat lower than hers, surrounded by a wide buffer of trees and a long gravel path with only a single broken light near the barn. She parked on the edge of public access, walked the last stretch on foot with a flashlight low and her shoulders squared. The hay shed stood just where she remembered it from the satellite maps, squat, rusted, with doors slightly ajar. He was already there. Not Willard, but someone younger. Early 40s, maybe. Work shirt, jeans, hands calloused, face drawn with a tension that looked permanent. He didn't introduce himself, just looked at her for a long second, then said, "You don't know what you're standing on, do you?" Michelle said nothing. He continued, his voice low, almost tired. "This whole valley's been used for years. Willard didn't start it, but he kept it running. Quiet dumping, unreported runoff, buried pesticide drum stuff no one wanted to deal with. Your uncle knew. He stayed quiet, didn't like it, but didn't push." Michelle's voice was calm. "And now? Now you're loud," the man said. "You're on paper. You bring surveyors, lawyers, judges. That makes people nervous. Nervous people act stupid." Michelle took a slow breath. "Are you one of them?" "I'm the guy who drives a fertilizer truck and knows what soil shouldn't smell like after a rain," he said. "I'm not telling you this because I like you. I'm telling you this because if they lose this land, the next thing that happens is questions, and tests, and subpoenas." He turned, walked a few paces away, then added over his shoulder, "I left a name in your mailbox. Private testing firm. Neutral. You want to end this clean, you'll need outside data. Not county. Not state." Then he was gone. Michelle waited a few minutes before moving. She didn't follow him. Didn't call out. She just walked back to her car, got in, and drove with the headlights off until she hit the main road. Her hands didn't shake. Not then. The next morning, a plain envelope waited in her motel mailbox. No return address. Inside, a business card from a small firm based 2 counties west, specializing in independent land use verification, with a handwritten note mentioned the East Mill case. Michelle didn't hesitate. She called that afternoon, scheduled an on-site review, and paid the full deposit herself. Angela, when informed, paused only briefly before saying, "Good. If this firm gives you evidence of illegal contamination or misuse, that changes the game. It moves us from a civil dispute to potential criminal exposure. That's not just leverage, that's control." The inspection was scheduled for the following Thursday. Michelle didn't tell Grant. She didn't tell anyone. She simply arrived that morning, unlocked the gate, and waited as the van pulled up unmarked, quiet, professional. The two technicians worked without small talk. They took soil cores, water samples, and residue swabs from the bluff line and plastic barrels she had found weeks earlier. They didn't ask questions. They didn't comment on what they saw. They finished in just under 3 hours, thanked her politely, and left. Michelle stood alone for several minutes after they were gone, staring at the place where the creek disappeared under the trees. The sky above her was pale and empty, the sun flat against the dry horizon. Everything felt suspended. She didn't know what the results would show, but she knew this something had already broken. The silence, the balance, the invisible line of assumed control that Willard had once held without question, it was gone. And whatever came next, it would happen on her terms. The lab report arrived 5 days later in a white envelope marked confidential client copy only. It didn't need to scream to carry weight. Michelle opened it at the desk in her motel room, flipping past the cover page and straight into the results section. The conclusions were written in neutral, technical language, but even she could read through the tone. Soil samples near the creek bed showed elevated levels of aldrin and dieldrin-banned pesticides with a known history of groundwater contamination. One of the water samples tested positive for residue consistent with industrial degreasers solvents that had no business being anywhere near agricultural property. And though the levels weren't catastrophic, they were above recommended exposure thresholds. The report made no conclusions about who had placed the chemicals there or when. That wasn't its purpose. But it did verify the most important thing: there was contamination, and it was real. Angela reviewed the findings and wasted no time. She submitted the report directly to the County Environmental Division with a formal complaint, flagged the location coordinates, and attached the testing firm's credentials to preempt any challenge about validity. But that wasn't the move that shifted the balance. The real blow came when Angela sent a courtesy copy of the report to the Land Use Committee, specifically to the same department that had issued Michelle the compliance notice just weeks before. The message was subtle, but sharp. If they were going to accuse her of improper land use, then they needed to answer for why they had allowed contaminated runoff to go uninspected for years under their watch. That same afternoon, Michelle received a terse phone call from a man who introduced himself only as Deputy Director Green. His tone was defensive, measured, and quick to clarify that his office had no prior knowledge of chemical violations on the property in question, and that a site inspection would be scheduled within the month. Michelle said nothing. She didn't need to. The moment had arrived, the point where silence started costing the people who had once benefited from it. She didn't hear anything from Willard Rex for 3 days. Not a phone call, not a letter, not an appearance. Then, early Thursday morning, she arrived at the property to find a vehicle already parked near the southern boundary. A black SUV with tinted windows and out-of-county plates. Angela had warned her that once the report was submitted, people might start surfacing quietly, unofficially, and with a vested interest in controlling the narrative before it spilled into public view. She pulled in slowly, parked on the opposite side of the entrance, and stepped out without haste. The driver's side door of the SUV opened, and out stepped a man in a navy windbreaker, late 50s, with a face that looked accustomed to saying little and listening too well. "Miss Harrison," he said, not smiling. "I understand you've had a busy month." Michelle folded her arms. "I don't know who you are." "I'm not here to challenge your claim," he replied quickly, raising both hands as if to prove it. "In fact, I'm not officially here at all. I'm just someone who's been asked to understand what might be escalating." Michelle didn't move. She wasn't intimidated, but she also wasn't naive. This wasn't a casual drop-in. The man continued. "There are people who prefer problems like this get resolved without turning into case files or headlines. No one benefits when old dirt becomes public record, especially not when it predates the current owners." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then they shouldn't have buried anything." He gave a small nod, almost acknowledging her point, then said, "You've made your position clear. Is that matters. You have every legal right to press forward. But just understand some people may not give up their history so easily, even if it was borrowed land. Michel didn't answer. He turned, opened his door, and got back inside. The SUV reversed in silence and drove off without another word. That afternoon, Angela filed a motion to compel testimony from Willard Rex regarding historical land use practices on adjoining properties. It was a tactical play not meant to produce immediate answers, but to lock him into a legal posture. Once compelled, any statements he made could be used in civil or criminal proceedings. Angela expected resistance. What she didn't expect was what happened next. 2 days later, just before the scheduled review hearing on the boundary dispute, Angela received a call from a county representative advising that Willard Rex had officially withdrawn his claim of adverse possession. No explanation, no substitution of parties, just a quiet, unceremonious withdrawal. The hearing was canceled, the review process closed. Michelle's title was now uncontested and fully recognized by the county. But the story didn't end with a clean declaration of victory. Hours after the claim was withdrawn, Michelle received a package at the motel. No name, no return address. Inside was a faded map hand-drawn, annotated, old enough to show creases worn nearly to tearing. It detailed the entire parcel and surrounding properties with remarkable precision. A red X was marked near the creek bed, with 3 dates listed in small handwriting: -2001, 2004, 2009. On the back was a single sentence: "If this goes down, I'm not going with it alone." She brought the map to Angela the next morning. Neither of them recognized the handwriting, but the meaning was unmistakable. Someone else knew what had been done to that land. Someone with their own buried skeletons, and a fear of becoming the scapegoat if the story ever reached a courtroom. Angela wasn't shaken. She was calculating. "This is a pressure valve," she said. "It means they're fractured. Someone inside wants an exit plan. That's leverage, and it's valuable." Michelle didn't say what she was thinking. That she hadn't come here looking for leverage. That she had simply wanted to protect what was hers. But the reality was no longer that simple. She wasn't just defending property now, she was a live wire in a closed circuit that had run without interruption for years. And someone had just signaled they were ready to break that circuit before it broke them. Over the following week, the work resumed. The southern boundary was reset with permanent fencing. The environmental review began in full, slow, and methodical. Angela worked behind the scenes to ensure Michelle's full legal insulation, drafting immunity provisions and third-party disclosures to cover any findings unrelated to her ownership period. Michelle kept to the work. She didn't celebrate. She didn't grandstand. She focused on the land, on grounding herself in its shape, its texture, its rhythm. Because while the legal battle had ended, something deeper had shifted. And the land was no longer just a place she had inherited. It had become the line she refused to surrender. By mid-October, the land was quiet again, but not in the same way it had been when Michelle first arrived. The silence now wasn't born from neglect, it came from order. The overgrowth was gone. The perimeter was marked, permanent, and undisputed. The fencing was complete, the signage official, the coordinates updated in both county and federal registries. Everything that had been contested was now settled in writing, in boundary stones, and in law. Michelle walked the southern edge of the property that morning, boots pressing into the freshly compacted earth, the cool air of autumn threading through the fields like something alive and alert. The final report from the environmental agency had come in 3 days earlier. The contamination had been formally logged. No criminal charges had been filed yet, but citations had been issued, fines proposed, and a full investigation into regional land use practices initiated by the state. Michelle had declined to participate beyond submitting her testing firm's findings. Her involvement was now a matter of record, carefully documented as a third-party inheritor with no connection to historical practices. Angela had handled all correspondence, deflecting any attempt to drag Michelle into further proceedings. And so the wheels turned, slowly but decisively, without her needing to stand in front of any more strangers explaining what had already been proven. Willard Rex never reappeared. According to Angela's sources, he had sold one of his adjacent parcels 2 weeks after withdrawing his claim and transferred another into a family trust, likely attempting to shield it from future liability. He had not filed counterclaims, not challenged any boundary resets, not spoken to local press. Whatever power he had once held over the land had been severed not by confrontation, but by exposure. Michelle didn't feel triumphant. She felt resolved. There was no satisfaction in proving someone wrong when the cost was systemic damage, hidden dangers, and decades of buried negligence. But there was peace in knowing the truth wasn't hidden anymore. She kept the parcel. She didn't sell it. She didn't build a home or install security systems or make statements about legacy. Instead, she converted it into something else entirely: a conservation easement. Working with a regional environmental nonprofit, she dedicated the land to restoration, soil rehabilitation, native plant regrowth, and protection of the creek that had once been used as a dumping ground. The agreement barred commercial development. It mandated monitoring. It placed the property beyond the reach of quiet hands and invisible intentions. Michelle signed the documents without ceremony, knowing exactly what it meant. No one would ever use that land again for silence. She wouldn't allow it. Grant finished his contract and left the site in good order. He never asked questions about the investigations, never speculated on the rumors that had circulated through town. On his last day, as he loaded the final equipment into his truck, he gave Michelle a firm handshake and said, "Most folks would have walked. He didn't. That matters." It was the kind of statement that didn't require a response, and she gave none. Angela closed the file with a formal letter. All legal matters resolved, ownership finalized, protections in place. Her tone was businesslike, but the closing line carried something more. Most clients want to win. You wanted to fix it. That's rarer than you think. Michelle moved back to Chicago by the end of the month. She returned to her apartment, her work, her familiar rhythms. She didn't tell many people about what had happened. Not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't need to be retold. The land had been reclaimed. The lies buried in it had been dragged into the open. The systems that had once looked the other way had been forced, however reluctantly, to acknowledge their failure. And the person who had tried to rewrite the truth of her ownership was now exactly where he belonged, outside the boundary line, without a claim, without a voice in the matter. Weeks later, a certified envelope arrived. It contained an anonymous note. One line: "You left a mark." No signature. No sender. Michelle folded it once and slid it into the back of the file folder she kept locked in her cabinet. She didn't need to know who had sent it. She knew what it meant. There were no more disputes. No more hearings. No new letters, threats, or visitors. The story ended as it should, with the land intact, the records corrected, and the history preserved, not because someone allowed it, but because someone refused to abandon it. Michelle never went back. She didn't need to. It was hers. And now, finally, no one questioned that. Not on paper. Not in court. Not in silence.